Hello, everyone. Welcome to the section on Biolaw, co-sponsored. Hold on. That's better. I have two windows open so I can see you all in Chatland, and that was one of my instructions that I failed to do. So now, nonetheless, welcome to the section on Biolaw and co-sponsored by IP, Science Fiction and the Law. Today we have several law professors and my good friend and sci-fi author John Scalzi to talk about the topic. Just very quickly, so we can get into the meat, we have with us, in no particular order, Mark Blitz, whose scholarship has explored how emerging technologies raise challenges for courts applying First Amendment and Fourth Amendment doctrine. His most recent work has gotten heavily into questions about VR, as we'll hear about today. Professor Camilla Hurdy has focused on federal, state, and local governments about innovation and economic development. And her co-author, Dan Breen, is, I believe, IP counsel at Phillips currently, and has been a professor as well as a practicing partner, has a background in physics. And their work has been really trying to draw on some ideas from patents and how they cross over into sci-fi and questions of what we can learn from that. And then we have Victoria Sutton. Victoria is the Paul Whitfield Horn Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of Center for Biodefense, which is obviously a huge topic right now. Like, in some ways, us not getting sucked into a COVID discussion might be welcome, but almost sad with Victoria on our panel. And she's the sort of person who makes me feel like, I am clearly not done enough, because she has not only a BS in zoology, a BS in animal science, an MPA, a PhD, and a JD. And so I just play a professor on TV by comparison. With that, let's get into it. And as part of that, I will then also introduce John Scalzi. John, whether it's good or bad, I don't know. We have known each other since high school, and just good fortune on my part. And is, I can easily say, one of the most known sci-fi authors in the country. And one of the things I do love about John, as a side note, if you ever get to see him at his public appearances when that happens again, is he's very much into connecting with his audience and takes care of his fans, I would say, better than anyone I've ever seen. And with that, years ago, John, when he writes things, we'd sometimes kick around ideas. And two books, The Android's Dream and Fuzzy Nation, actually did have legal components. Now, there is no way that I gave him, legal advice, because he doesn't pay me. But more importantly, there were interesting questions that we riffed on. And in the past few weeks, as we were thinking about this, John pointed out that law did influence those books. So with that, John, could you share how you thought law fit for those two books, please?
Well, I think law fits in the same way that science fits in science fiction, or psychology fits in science fiction, or any of these things fits in science fiction. What we do is we take the information that we have now about how things work today, and then we try to responsibly extrapolate into the future about how the law would work and how the legal system would work. Because the thing is in the future, we absolutely will have legal systems. They're not going to go away. I mean, dystopia aside, Mad Max aside, but even then, people have rules that they live by. But if you have a galactic civilization, or if you have the interdependency, a system of planets working together, they are all going to have rules that they live by. And what you have to do is you take what you know now and you go, how can I build this so that in the future, all of this stuff makes sense, and no one's who's going to read it is immediately pulled out and says, no, this doesn't make sense by what we know from the legal systems today. So that's the starting block of any way that you, or at least I, approach legal systems in science fiction.
So was there anything in particular that you felt was useful from bringing in a legal structure for Android's Dream or Fuzzy Nation?
Well, one of the things that I thought was really useful for Android's Dream, for example, was the power of precedent. The Earth has been incorporated into a galactic confederation that has been around for literally tens of thousands of years. And because of that, within the structure of that galactic confederation, there's very little that doesn't have precedent. And so it's very important for them to be able to pull up all that sort of stuff. And in fact, a plot point happens, and it's not really a spoiler, that one of the cool aspects is here is a point of law that has not already been massively explored, and therefore, by defining this, you will literally go down in legal history. And this is immediately attractive to the people involved in that particular moment. With Fuzzy Nation, the real issue was what it means to be sentient, to be cognizant, to be not human, but sapient. And for that, looking at the history of law as to who gets to be a person and what are the issues about humanity. These are really important topics to essay, and then again, to move forward into the situation that I developed in those books.
Awesome. So this actually brings up, in a way, things you and I have talked about, and I think connects to the work of Dan and Camilla, which was the hard versus soft science fiction. And if I'm hearing John right, part of the idea is the structures themselves set up a world. And I think, as John and I have talked in the past, one of the things that's a danger for any fiction author is to put it more broadly. You can't set up things and sort of insult your audience with, now I'm doing something outside of those bounds. And one of the things that remind me of in my past discussions then was for Dan and Camilla, you have this quote in your paper: as a general matter, non-enabled science fiction like the X-Men entertains, but it doesn't teach. Now, I'm sure there's hardcore fans out there who'll say, whoa, X-Men has all sorts of moral teaching, but I don't think that's what you're trying to get at. And I'm wondering if you two could share how that notion of teaching fits into this idea of rules and structures and what's possible or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Devin. I think it's interesting because you chose, Dan and I were talking about that yesterday. You chose a great quote that I think we meant more tongue in cheek, right? Our point was to link the X-Men to our thesis that certain kinds of science fiction teach in the patent sense, or can potentially teach in the patent sense, right? However, especially after reading Professor Sutton's and Professor Blitz's papers, no one would come away saying science fiction and fantasy don't teach in ways that have nothing to do with their technological teaching. So, for example, Professor Sutton talks about using Michael Crichton's Prey in order to explore the implications if the military got a new scientific technology and released it in the world. That's teaching, right? It's the moral and political, social implications of technology. So I wouldn't overread that quote. However, it's a wonderful example of what you talk about, the soft versus hard distinction, which I think is something really important to bring up right off the bat, right? That science fiction, for better or worse, has been divided into sort of soft sci-fi, whose purpose is to explore the social implications of technologies. And an example, of course, would be sort of Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, right? Whereas other science fiction, which I think is in some ways, I mean, it's rightly considered almost a different genre, is really there to explore the technicalities and the technical stuff. And I would put sort of more like Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov in there, people who are really interested in the technology and science itself. And I think Dan's in my paper is more focused on the latter, in the sense that we are analogizing, pretty hard analogy between sci-fi and the teachings in patents. So.
Well, cool. I mean, Dan, so with that idea, then what is it, as someone who's done, and continues to be in practice, this notion of, well, what is it that you all hope people see as this connection between, I think you had a pun, if I remember, on Fosada, just quickly, if you don't mind. What do you, or however you want to get into what Camilla was saying, right? Which is this idea of, there's certain things about the hard aspect that you all are celebrating and want people to see.
Yeah, I think what's important to us was we kept encountering this ongoing dialogue among authors and commentators in sci-fi about this delineation and drawing lines between sci-fi, fantasy, hard, soft, and really, what we saw that as was fundamentally an acknowledgement of when there is what we would analogize to patent law enablement, a sort of plausibility threshold based or rooted in some semblance of science fact, or at least scientific hypothesis, but as John said earlier, you can extrapolate upon from there. And really what we see is less a dichotomy where you have to lump one genre or one work into a different category, was a sort of continuum. And just like in a patent, you may claim an invention in many different degrees of generality or specificity, some of which may be enabled, some of which may not. What seemed to matter to the commentators and to the fans that we spoke with, and even to Kim Stanley Robinson, who we interviewed for the essay, was that there is at least some quantified minimum level of teaching in there that is enough for the reader, the fans, what we call the fan of ordinary skill in the art, to find it plausible. And what was interesting to us is that the works that seem to have at least a few of those kinds of claims were able to track that fairly directly from the record of the science fiction literature to a real world inventor to a real world patent. And we give a number of examples in the essay. Unsurprisingly, Jules Verne shows up multiple times because he dwelled on and really, I think, reveled in his ability to imagine on the page things that he didn't necessarily have the capability to create in the real world. But those claims, nonetheless, stimulated real problem-solving thinking among inventors who credited Verne directly for inspiring their actual inventions.
So John, if I remember, in Old Man's War, was it the Brain Pal, John?
Yes, there was the Brain Pal. We also had Smart Blood.
Right. Sort of so for those who haven't read, John, can you quickly explain what Brain Pals are?
So Brain Pals were basically the idea that you would have a computer resident in your head that would not only be able to access information, but would be able to anticipate and augment your own desires and systems. And so when very recently people like Elon Musk are talking about, implanting things into your brain, they're like, that's just like Brain Pal. Are you gonna sue Elon Musk? And I'm like, well, one, no, because I am not, of course, the first person to be thinking about this. It goes, things go all the way back to Verne and even before then. But more interestingly, I think to Dan's point, having written about that, other people pick things up and extrapolate from them. They're like, this is an interesting idea. How can we make that real? And it doesn't only happen, again, with the science. It does happen when, for example, I have had discussions with people about legal issues that I bring up in Android Stream and in Fuzzy Nation and other places where they're like, wait a minute, did you actually talk to a lawyer about that? I'm like, I don't have a time machine, so no, I did not. But I'm sure that there's some way that an actual lawyer can go from where I began.
Yeah, and so the thing about Brain Pal that jumped to mind here for me is one of the things that struck me is I don't think your paper, Dan and Camilla, got into some of the other stuff. Maybe if I remember correctly, people challenged some of the claims to patents on iPads based on Star Trek. So the back and forth, what John talked about of, well, wait, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe good sci-fi prevents certain patents. I don't know. We can let the patent people argue that. Camilla, yeah.
We did get into that at the end. In fact, Dan has an entire prior paper on using sci-fi as prior art to preempt patents.
Oh, I remember that. But was iPad explicit? I don't remember if it was. If I missed it, I'm sorry.
What explicit?
Specifically, just the iPad is what I was wondering about. But absolutely, the paper does a lovely job pointing out the prior art question. And so that's just what made me think about it. Brain Pals is the notion of, it sounds like, yes, to the audience who may not have had a chance to see this, the paper nicely talks about this interesting back and forth in a way of, wait a minute, some of this stuff courts have said, it's obvious, it's out there. And so I thought you all picking up on that is just a very lovely point about this notion of the hardness of certain science fiction. But that kind of then, I think, bridges us into Mark's work, because Mark's work really gets in the wild world of some real tech and some future tech, right? It's about virtual reality, implanted memories, and more. And there's a part here where what I jumped out for me, Mark, was when you acknowledged, look, clearly there's not 100% good or bad in this situation. As a quote, you said, where a VR world doesn't supplement provide a recess for our lives in real communities and in attacking genuine problems, but rather crowds it out. Government should be left with room for protecting us from being swallowed whole by such an artificial world. It might also assure that what we do to ourselves doesn't undercut the obligations we have to the justice system and to others. Where VR world doesn't enhance our freedom of thought, but puts our mental experience under someone else's control, First Amendment interests might not only allow government to defend individual autonomy, it might require that it do so. So I don't disagree, but I'm curious, why now? Why get into, shall we say, brain pals and or other versions of virtual reality and control that, as you say, is quite speculative, which may not pass, shall we say, the hard science test of Dan and Camilla's work. What are you hoping to get from that? Where are you headed?
Okay, so a couple of responses to that. Apart from the one that always comes to mind first, which is just that it's a lot of fun for me to think and write about it, and so maybe I'll do it no matter what. But here are two. One, and I did plan this. I'm not just sort of remembering this. So I have this in front of me on the screen. I want to just quote from one science fiction essayist. I've begun a lot of pieces with science fiction. And one in 2014, I began with the famous science fiction essayist Louis Brandeis, who in 1928 wrote, "The progress of science in furnishing the government with means of espionage is not likely to stop with wiretapping. Ways may someday be developed by which the government, without removing papers from secret drawers, can reproduce them in court, and by which it will be enabled to expose to a jury the most intimate occurrences of the home. Advances in the psychic and related sciences may bring means of exploring unexpressed beliefs, thoughts, and emotions." You know where that's from? So that's from his dissent. It's not an essay. It's not science fiction. It's a dissenting opinion in a 1928 case where the Supreme Court majority said that wiretapping someone was not a search. He, in his dissent, was arguing it is, and he was sort of imagining, let's not stop at wiretapping. Let's imagine what else won't be a search unless we anticipate the future. So one reason to think about things way ahead of time is, although I think it's true, the way that legal doctrine works in the American system, and I think to some extent in other systems, even when they're not common law systems, is there's a lot you can't say about the law until you know what reality it's applying to and how things are going to work in detail. So it's not as though Brandeis at that time in 1928, I mean, even today, almost a century later, we don't know to what extent, what kind of law will work for psychic sciences, because we're only at the beginning. We are at the beginning of a kind of mind reading, if you've been following what's going on with brain scanning. But I still think it helps, even decades in advance, to think a little bit about it in terms of the future of the doctrine. There's also, to cite another, I know the piece I submitted for the panel, as you said, was on virtual reality, but for the Fourth Amendment is also a kind of a nice place to mine. So there's a 2001 case called Biolaw versus United States about law enforcement officers using a thermal imager from a street to see inside a house. And in that case, Justice Scalia said, well, we don't only want to think about thermal imaging now. It's crude, but we want to develop a law, we want to develop doctrine. I don't think he aspires to cover whatever is 150 years in the future, but he wants a doctrine that we won't have to change entirely. So part of, I think, thinking about science fiction linkages is to anticipate what will happen. And I can't resist doing one more thing. I don't know, can you see this? This is analog 1949. And this is in this 1949 edition of Analog is the story with which I began my first published piece from Henry Kuttner and Catherine L. Moore, where in 1949, they actually asked a legal question, which is what kind of a legal system could deal with a world? How would crime investigation work in a world where everything we do is recorded? Because in the story, people extract records from any kind of material, the walls, the floor, ground, whatever. Now, of course, the science of that, although correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think there's any science that will get that information about everything I've done in the past. Yet what they wrote was useful. And it's impressive that in 1949, they were kind of imagining, well, what limits might exist on law enforcement's ability to use this stuff. And although their science wasn't right, nowadays, you don't need the ground to record light because we have cameras everywhere. And the Supreme Court is confronting those questions. What kind of access? So one answer why I think about things ahead of time is that sometimes it's still helpful to at least begin to anticipate issues. Just one quote on virtual reality from Howard Rheingold, who wrote an overall, not science fiction story, just an overview of the technology. And I think it was 1991. He said, by the time we're immersed in virtual reality, we'll be too busy becoming whatever we're becoming. Better to think about these questions now. So that's one answer. Then, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation, so I'll be quick. Another, I think, answer about the use that science fiction or fantasy or whatever genre, theological science fiction, which is to some extent what Philip K. Dick is writing, is useful is just because it helps us conceptually think through law, even when the science isn't real or isn't possible. So to just give one example, even if we're not at the cusp of real in-depth mind reading, it helps us to understand the privilege against self-incrimination, to ask, would it violate the privilege against self-incrimination for law enforcement to be able to use mind reading? And there are scholars who've done that. And even without citing other science fiction, they just say, what it helps us understand what self-incrimination is about, to ask whether or not law enforcement use of mind reading would violate it.
That's great. That's very good. Obviously I'm sympathetic to everything on this panel. For some people who know, I remember when I wrote the paper about 3D printing and how it would probably mess with the patent system just because it's changed all sorts of assumptions. And when John and I have kicked this around, what we came up with is, it's an unfortunately overused phrase, but it's about disruption, right? It is what, and John, you had used a phrase that I thought fit for some of what this panel is trying to get at, is the what happens concept that story writers should almost always have, right? Like you're asking, well, what if? And I'm curious in from what you've heard so far in your work or others, where is there anything that maybe you remember even when you were starting to want to be a writer, that just a book or two or an idea that was that, wow, what if really grabbed you?
I will say there's a quote that I remember from a long time ago that because I heard it early, fixed in my brain. And I can't remember the science fiction author who said it, although someone on this panel will probably remind me. But they said anybody can imagine the car, the science fiction writer imagines the traffic jam, which is to say that we are always, what makes science fiction is not the idea of, hey, wouldn't it be great to have a spaceship to the stars? But the question of, okay, we have a spaceship to the stars, there's a very specific amount of energy that it takes to get there. And if someone stows away, then we won't have enough energy to make it. What happens then? And so literally every time that I think about anything, I think about how do we break it? How do we mess with it? How is this function in a way that isn't meant to, or that isn't expected? And I'll give one sort of related anecdote. Back at the turn of the century, I reviewed video games. I reviewed video games with the eye of looking at it as parents would, what things do they need to look out for? So whenever I would play a video game, I would play it like a hyperactive 10-year-old boy, like stuffed full of sugar, trying to find all the ways to break it. So like when I got The Sims, the very first iteration of The Sims, the first thing I did was I put a sim in a 1 meter by 1 meter box to find out what happens. And what happens is they spin around, they pee themselves, and they die. because that's what a 10-year-old will do. Science fiction writers are professional 10-year-old boys in this respect. We are always looking for the way that technology, that society, that the future will break in ways that we don't expect.
Fantastic point. And I think this actually then connects very well with, in my mind, with Victoria's work, right? Because Victoria's paper, she's getting into an explicit argument about using Michael Crichton's Prey. Crichton, in my mind, is definitely, I don't think anyone could really argue, but law professors will, certainly one of the best at taking science and running with it. And I think Camilla may have been someone when we were prepping a little via email, Jurassic Park. I remember distinctly, there were science people saying, not a chance. Not that long after that, things that he said would become commonplace in terms of genome sequencing, et cetera, were happening. Not that they're cloning, extinct things yet. But I'm curious, and Victoria, when you said by using science fiction cautionary tales like Prey, which I think, by the way, very much you nail a lot of what Crichton's doing in almost all of his work, we can guide our students to the knowledge, tools, and skills they need to analyze, litigate, regulate, and negotiate using the law to realize not only good lawyering, but lawyering that is good. And really, I think you picking Crichton and this statement connects so well to his history, right? So Westworld, a lot of people point out, is in a way was a warm-up for Jurassic Park. It is also a theme park with a lot of interesting things gone totally amok. And I'm curious then, what is it about Prey and this project of yours that you feel is important as a way to reach lawyers and society?
Well, I think, thank you for that. And I got to say, I've just been a sponge on this panel. It's been so exciting to hear from all of you. It's great to find you. I got excited about this project because it's, you want to draw law students into a problem. And I teach emerging technologies law. So a lot of it is like BMI, brain machine interface, like we've been talking about today. This is all in the future. A lot of it is in the future. So we have to talk about what if. And Prey offers what if. The entire book is what if. What if a government contractor used technology that's pretty much on the horizon and created something that resulted in all these exciting torts? What do we do with it? Is there a way? Why is this different than an ordinary tort? So a lot of what this gives us a chance to do is say, why is this different than the kinds of legal problems we have today? Can we apply what we have? But how is it slightly different? How is it that we have to adjust or find precedent or have cases of first impression when we are dealing with these new scenarios? And if you can draw a law student in on something that sounds plausible, and that's what he does with this story, he makes it very plausible that you can make it more of a real problem. So when they're faced with these problems, not only will they have the skills to analyze it as a lawyer, but they'll also have some morality concepts about it because, of course, this is a dystopian story and it's a cautionary tale of this is where we don't want to be. And if you can have law students think about that before it happens, then I think you've done a good service to the practice of law. And in many ways, that's why I came to teach law, was I knew a lot of lawyers who didn't know anything about science and they were mucking it up badly. And I was in the White House Science Office for a while. And so I got a chance to see that firsthand, very up close, lawyers that would come in and not understand the science and make quite a mess of it. So this also gives them a way, I'm going back to that comment also about writing is intended to entertain and not teach. And I totally agree with that. but to the extent that it entertains, it also tweaks ideas that the reader has. And you've got a readership of law students. They see a litigation and everything as a 1L. You know that as 1Ls, they see everything as a legal case or a legal issue. So you've got a great audience to look at it and issue spot. And so you've got a whole exciting period of issue spotting with these stories. And then you go into how then do you go about resolving them. So in this particular story, I loved it because the entire book ended up with somebody's going to get sued here. And that's actually what Crichton wrote. And I thought, wow, what a springboard for an entire case. So I usually have my students read, and I do this in my nanotechnology class. I teach nanotechnology in law too. And over spring break, they read Prey, and then they come back and do the trial the second half. And I'll just, I did create a case file if anybody actually wants to try to do it. It is on Amazon. It's Foreman versus Imos, and I actually use the character's name. I guess this is a kind of fan fiction, and they haven't objected yet, so I guess I'll keep doing it. But if you ever want to try it, you've got a case file here, and it's fun to play through. The students really enjoy it. I've had students write back to me, by the way, because I've been doing this since about maybe 2014, and I've had students actually write back and say, wow, I found myself in a particular case where all of this came in handy. Scientific evidence, of course, comes in to play always in these kinds of scenarios. So, so it actually does make quite an impression when you can take the great work that a writer has done. I mean, I know we like our final exam essays that we craft, but we don't spend quite as much time with them as, say, our hypotheticals as a writer does with a great edited science fiction story. So it's a great way to draw students in on that. So, yeah, I love to use it. I might just add, since you mentioned I do pandemics, biosecurity law, I did this book on the 50 movies that are pandemic related movies and the legal issues that are in each one of those movies. And I also use that as a teaching tool in my biosecurity law class. Until I wrote the book, I had everybody analyze the movies. And once I wrote the book, I couldn't really ask them to analyze the movies. But and that also is a good teaching tool because it does present lots of, even zombie movies have interesting issues, as you know. So thank you for that.
No, it's fantastic. One of the things I love about being at Georgia Tech and in a business school is I am getting to do some of the crossover you described, where I think it's a multi-way street, right? Lawyers don't necessarily get science. Scientists, certainly a lot of CS people I work with say, doesn't the law do this? Like, yeah, not really. But that's actually the best part, is getting those crossovers to kind of figure out what is and isn't. And I also used to teach professional responsibility. And I think for the panel then, I'm curious then, how much does this help? I think it does. But what Victoria reminds me of, getting students, and I do this with my business students, to actually start to go, certainly as a lawyer, the notion of, well, sure, you could do this in terms of it's possible, but whether one ought to do it, the old classic thing. It's very difficult to still tell someone, yeah, technically that's possible. You have the power. But how do you help? Do you find this work might help you tell students, think through this. If you're an in-house attorney, because I've been in that role where I had to get into a CEO's face and say, no, it's not an easy place to be, for all of the law professors chest thumping of, just do a noisy exit and stand up, that's a lot easier said than done. I was lucky because at the time I had, no family and no debt. So if I was without a job, John used to say, well, I guess you could live in my basement. And he once actually told his wife, there's a wee chance Devin's moving in with us. It didn't have to happen, but I was grateful to have the safety net. But that's a very luxurious place to be, frankly. Actually, his basement is luxurious too, but that's a different story. Anyhow, so just to bring it back, I'm just curious, other folks on the panel, in terms of instructional, and also for John, I'm just curious from your perspective, is there sort of a responsibility to how one writes fiction, because you are world building? So since I threw that to the group, someone wave at me on the screen that no one can see, and we'll go with that as a raised hand, please. Or I'll call on someone. I can do that. John, go ahead.
I mean, for me, we are not obliged to be responsible in our fiction, but we do have I think, some duty of care to be cognizant that people will then read what we have speculated and then go on from there. I'm not responsible for the person who reads my book and believes that it means that they should do X, Y, or Z that I didn't imagine that they did. But at the same time, I do want to make sure that I'm always pointing out that whatever your actions are in science fiction or in your day-to-day life or whatever, there are consequences and there are responsibilities. Again, it's the whole what if issue, right? No matter what you speculate with the what if, you are presenting a world. There are some assumptions that you bring into it and that you make. And with regard to going back to the thing about teaching versus entertainment, we always teach regardless of whether we intend to or not, right? Because particularly with science fiction, so much of the audience is, I want that. How do I do that? Or that makes sense to me. I'm going to go live my life that way, right? So we almost in science fiction and fantasy have a pedagogical aspect of it that a lot of other genres don't actually have to deal with. So it's always in my mind that there is some awareness that somebody might look at what I write and be like, oh, well, that makes sense. I'm moving forward on that. He was the one who gave me that idea. It's his fault.
Camilla, it looked like you wanted to jump in earlier. Is that correct?
Oh, well, I always want to jump in.
Oh, well, then please do.
But yeah, I mean, to the extent that we're talking about teaching, I mean, there's a lot to add about the interface of the science fiction and intellectual property, which is, where I'm naturally going to head with my brain. But I will say that there's something about the memes developed in sci-fi and fantasy that really connect with the students. So I was really struck by Professor Sutton's paper because I can see why you designed a course around prey. When I'm teaching intro to IP, I sometimes am struggling to explain a concept to students. I so often find myself turning to the X-Men, to Star Wars, to Star Trek. There's something there. And of course, a lot of this has to do with what Dan and I are writing about, right? That sci-fi involves technology, and intellectual property, in particular patent law, is often relating to technology, but it really connects with students. So I just wanted to second this idea of using not just works of fiction, but works of extremely imaginative fiction to explore the legal implications of things that we don't yet know about. I just think that's going to be a connecting theme here.
Awesome. Mark, I think you had something that, and if I'm right, but I also have a question and almost a request. Okay, let's go dark side, Mark. Where's the problem here? Because I think you have your figure on that, and I'm thinking, I'll be a little more specific. Of late, I've noticed in legal scholarship these provocations, and I'll be honest, some of them I'm like, well, they're provocative because they're insane, and that may be actually a problem. But you can ignore that piece. I'm curious where your head is on all this.
No, I think whatever mind reading technology you're using is like a few steps ahead of me, but I'll get there, I hope. Now, I was just going to comment, since we're talking about teaching, one other role. I'm not sure science fiction is actually, maybe fantasy is a better use of this. One thing that didn't come up before when we're thinking about how science fiction or fantasy or some other genre can actually provide things for students to think about is that at times, let's stick with fantasy for a moment, provides an illustration. It's a contrast, right? It provides an example of how things can't work in our world. And it's a jumping off point, I think, for then asking them, how have things work instead? So to be more concrete about that, take the unbreakable vow from Harry Potter, right? If you know that the unbreakable vow, right, is once people enter into an agreement with an unbreakable vow, they can't break the agreement, or I don't know, what happens, they die, I don't remember, right? But that really solves a lot of contract law, right? And I think that one thing you can do is you can sort of say, but things don't work that way in our world. So how can we, to the extent you like unbreakable vows, you would like a world like that, how can the law get you closer? Or when I talk about constitutional rights, I frequently analogize them to a force field. Liberty protections are like a force field. But we don't really have force fields around our physical force fields around our rights. So how then, if we don't have that kind of a world, how can we get protection like that? And of course, it gets very complex, right? You need to rely on courts. You need to do certain things. They need to do certain analyses. And sometimes it just doesn't work, right? When you have the force field, you want the force field, you don't have it, and your rights are vulnerable or violated. So I do that in my teaching sometimes. And I just was going to mention that. But I didn't, why don't you, you wanted to move the conversation to a different place. So I just wanted
No. I that was great. I think that's an extra layer as to how this all fits. But I may be wrong, but I was curious. Your paper touched on the downsides to technology. So does Victoria's work, and I think also Camilla and Dan's point to the gaps there. But as a general matter, when John talks about it is fiction, and so I think one of the things early on we noticed was he has fans from pretty much every part of the political. It's not even a spectrum, right? It's like a big circle, and God knows throw darts as to who's on it. I thought that was a sign, in my mind, of good writing. It's just that it speaks to many different people, and that's the nature of art, in my opinion.
Okay.
Do law professors and lawyers have a little bit more responsibility, maybe? Because, clearly there's something lurking this week. There is a question about how much you should say, well, I think I can push this. And are there places that maybe part of sci-fi to get into where Victoria's head's at a little, I think, is to really get people to understand, look, you're going to break things too. Like there's a reason we have some of these rules. And I am not a huge fan of the precautionary principle, but the concept of, whoa, ought I not enable that?
So
is a big deal.
If I can make two comments then.
Please.
One's just a personal story. And I don't think I've told this in any public setting before. I don't think it's that embarrassing, but you judge. When I was a kid, I think I was about 12 and playing D&D constantly, round the clock. And I distinctly remember one afternoon where I'm just sitting in my room, really going back and forth about whether orcs really exist and trying to figure out whether it's true or not, because I had been so immersed in the world, I just sort of, and then I kind of snapped out on it. Yes, it's just part of the game. But, it's this sort of scary moment, scary small stretch of time where you lose track of reality. And that relates to what I wrote to, which is to what extent can technologies make this more of a danger, right? That is, to what extent can virtual reality, which is a virtual reality of the future, which is well designed, really immerse people in a false reality. Now, it turns out that since I submitted the draft, we now know, I guess it was clear before, but it's really clear now, you don't need virtual reality to immerse people in a false reality, right? Tweets seem to do the trick. But at the virtual reality, I think, could be scarier. Certain technologies can be scarier in terms of their potential to deceive even people who are willing and able to show skepticism about what they read. We're not used to, I think, bringing that same level of skepticism to our own perception. Similar questions are being raised now about deepfake videos. That's something where, you don't trust a video entirely, but you've assumed certain aspects of what a video produces can't be faked, and that's no longer true. So to link back to your earlier statement, to the extent that science fiction writers aren't just writing stories with words, to the extent that they are the scribes for a virtual experience that people are immersed in, I think there's more of a potential that they'll be creating fictions that become people's realities. In that kind of a world, that's not, I think, the world we live in yet, but in that kind of a world, I think that fiction is more dangerous. And I don't want to live in a society like Plato's Republic where fiction writers therefore are basically ordered to write things that have a certain kind of content. It's just kind of, there seems to be no good alternative in that situation.
That's a very good point about all the ways that people can slip into alternate realities, I suppose. We have about 15 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken. I think the panel goes for an hour. John, did you have anything more? But at the same time, I want to urge people, we have one question that has come up in the chat. And folks who are in the chat, if you have other questions, please just keep dumping them in there so I can see them. But in terms of this back and forth, I know you've seen this in sci-fi cons. There seems to be pretty ongoing discussion. And in a way, and this may be not exactly on point, but the whole cyberpunk world, right? Some people point to Neuromancer as where we got this world and that it got so embraced. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what Mark was saying, John.
I mean, the thing is that people really do imprint. They really want to look for things that are not necessarily simple solutions, but are solutions that make sense to them. One of the things about fiction that I always warn people is, of course, everything in fiction makes sense. It's intelligently designed. There is an actual structure of it, and that the people do logical things in it, or things happen to them that seem to be random yet are not, because someone is actually structuring it and being able to make the distinction between what is fiction and is ordered and it exists in a small box, as opposed to the real world, which is messy, which has consequences and all that sort of stuff. To Mark's point, and I noticed that Dan had his hand up, so I want to hear what he has to say about this sort of stuff. But to Mark's point, the thing about tweets and the things about virtual reality is they create the same sort of structured boxes, the same sort of structured discourse that makes things seem simpler or makes things seem ordered, which is actually the more important thing. To that extent, things like tweets, things like virtual reality, things like fiction all work and are ordered in the same way and represent a pitfall for people who can't tell the difference between their fiction, whether it's tweets or virtual reality or what I write or how Robert Heinlein writes or what Ayn Rand writes, and the real world.
And sorry, I didn't see your hand down. I was trying to monitor chat too and juggle things. So thanks, John, for catching up. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. This plays into what I was thinking when Mark was speaking, and I had sort of a follow-up question for you, John. Camilla and I have talked a lot about this idea that Arthur C. Clarke said. He said science fiction is something that could happen, but usually you wouldn't want it to. Fantasy is something that couldn't happen, though often you only wish that it could. And we see so many examples of when the imaginings of an author like yourself inspire and sometimes even become real world developments. The counterexamples of where science fiction is cited as a reason to stop something from happening are relatively rare. Camilla and I found one example of a recent instance in the United Kingdom where science fiction works were cited as justification for a law preventing hybridization between humans and animals. Not quite Jeff Goldblum The Fly, but other types of experiments. And I'm just curious, do you buy into the idea that science fiction is something often that you wish wouldn't happen? And can you account for what seems to be an asymmetry where, regardless of your intent, it seems that science fiction tends to bring things into the world much more than it does prevent certain things from coming into the world?
I think the answer to that is more complicated than it might seem. One, I think there is the positive aspect, as you say, where someone reads something in a science fiction thing or watches it and says, I want that, and then finds out how to do it. The old saying of the reason that Star Trek flip phones looked like they did was because some nerd wanted a communicator, right? So that's a good, easy example. But I do think that science fiction does actually work to avoid certain things, mostly by modeling. Like, for example, we haven't had a nuclear exchange. And part of the reason that we haven't had a nuclear exchange is that the modeling of the world after a nuclear exchange, starting from on the beach, moving through Mad Max and forward onto that, has shown over and over and over and over and over again, this is a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't want to do it. And maybe not necessarily rhetorically hammering on it, but just by showing that world, we have gotten to examine that world and see why we don't want to be there. This happens again with things like overpopulation, with things like bioterrorism, so on and so forth. We get to model these effects, and in doing so, we get to see the results of it and decide in a very sort of sub rosa way that that's not where we want to go. So specifically, a single piece of work being the thing that makes us avoid something like hybridization is very rare. But the gestalting of science fiction tropes allows us to hopefully avoid a lot of things. So I think it's a give and take. Individual things are easy to pull out and go, that's a cool idea, but tropes are the thing that help us to avoid stuff.
Thank you. That's great.
So it turns out, luckily, we actually have a little longer than I realized. There are some questions starting to come in, but are there other things the panel wanted to ping off of each other, or should we turn to questions?
I just wanted to raise how much I enjoyed John's red shirts, right? And just speaking of the, you wish it would happen, but really do you, right? Because, as a Star Trek fan, well, first of all, following on Mark, like as somebody who thought they were going to be a mutant until at least the age of 12, but also as a Star Trek fan, right? What Star Trek fan does not want to be in the Federation, right? What Star Trek fan does not want to be on the Star Trek Enterprise? And, Commander Riker's your friend, etc. But then when you start to look at the details of this, it's like, well, wait a minute. What if you're a red shirt, right? What if you're one of the crewmen who in every episode dies? And so I think that's just a wonderful example of this sort of both of a parody, but also of this line between like, you wish it would happen, but do you really? Because once you start to move from the, it could be possible, so it must be great, go there, and then you find that there's all kinds of downsides. I think science fiction is a wonderful way to explore that. And by the way, I did watch Jurassic Park last night, and it was way better than I even remembered. It may actually be one of the best films ever made.
The thing that I always tell people is that, and one of the reasons that for science fiction and fiction in general, you need to be very careful about modeling your life about it, is that it really tends to be the exceptional cases, right? Where it is the captain in this crisis situation. It's a lot of drama. It's a lot of crucible. What people don't realize is that the day-to-day life of science in a science fiction world will still be annoying, will still be you have to take out the trash. For many, many years, for decades, we were like, oh my gosh, we will have camera phones and they will be awesome. Hello, welcome to your future in a Zoom meeting.
Right. And and this is like, it's actually a great lesson for people who do patent law, right? It's this sort of ethos that, well, technology is going to save us, so therefore patents must be great. And of course, there's an assumption there that all technology is good, but technology has downsides, and there's just not many better ways to explore it than sci-fi. So you do a service.
So that's a perfect segue, since we're coming up on about 15 to 20 minutes to go, to we have at least 3 questions in the queue, and the first one is from our host, actually, in a way, from Nicholson Price. He wants to know what sci-fi text should be required reading for incoming members of Congress, or heck, law students, and why. And to do this, I'd like to just ask you all, take a moment and then just one quick title and why. Like, let's keep it a little tight so that everyone can take a run at that. If anyone has one that wants to jump in, and Victoria, you don't get to pick prey. No, you could, I suppose, but hopefully there's other ones that you also think fit this bill.
I have more.
Okay, cool. Mark.
Oh, and my memory of this is weak, so maybe I'll change my mind if people remind me. The Foundation series by Asimov.
And why?
Well, it begins with a collapsing civilization. And I think, first of all, cautionary tone, but also another important caution in there is that on the one hand, I think there's optimism about the ability of science and thinking to try to order society. On the other hand, that optimism isn't unlimited because I don't want to spoil it, but if you remember, right, it's based on this science for predicting society and using it, right? It's a hologram appearing. For those people who are originalists, I think this fits very well. The hologram of Harry Seldon appears every so often and tells, society what they should do. And at one point, though, this all goes completely wrong because not everything's predictable.
Great. Okay, so just so everyone can get in, that's great. And as a side note, if I'm not mistaken, I think Paul Krugman claims the notion of that prediction is what drew him to economics, but someone should check me on that. Does anyone else have a... Camilla, go for it.
I do, yeah. So I think it depends on what day of the year it is, what your answer is, right? A couple of years ago, I might have said, Joe Hadelman's The Forever War, right? Exploring the implications of the military. I might have said, Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. I might have said Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. I think today, honestly, my answer is Clockwork Orange.
All right. And although I have a guess as to why, do you want to give a quick one sentence why?
Well, it explores psychology that is irrational and inexplicable and veers into violence and insanity and makes you really have to deal with a dark psychology.
Cool. John's hands up. Go for it, John.
I would actually have them read Frankenstein, The Modern Prometheus, and I will tell you why. One, it's the wellspring of modern science fiction. Hands down, no issue there. Second of all, it covers a lot of philosophical and therefore in many ways launches into legal grounds. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a person? It also makes the point regarding science and science fiction that although our understanding changes, nobody believes that we could reanimate a body like they do or like Mary Wollstonecraft did in that particular novel. The ideas that she animates still continue on with us and are worth considering. So even though times change and fictions change, the ideas behind them are still important and stay with us.
Victoria?
I thought I understood the question, but now I'm going to have to ask you. What could you clarify?
Sure. It was what would be a required reading for someone who's an incoming member to Congress or perhaps law students? I think for you, let's just stay with Congress because you have that background.
Oh yes, that's good. So it's going to have to be 4th grade level. Okay. And you can read it in 15 minutes. I think the book, The Word, I think it's called The Word for World is Forest by Ursula. I can't remember her name.
Le Guin?
Ursula K. Le Guin.
Le Guin, yes. Because that encapsulates so many things that we're dealing with today, as well as the environment. And I think it would give, and the military, and all of that wrapped up into that very interesting fiction. And it's very short.
Awesome. Dan, you could go with Congress or perhaps, as I believe you're in-house now, though you don't have to frame it this way. Well, how about executives?
Well, let me stick with Congress because I want to pick up on Camilla's point. Maybe the particular day is one driver, but I would say, what committees are these legislators going to be part of? And because the one that jumped to my mind immediately was Ender's Game, and how, even though there's a lot of non-enabled sci-fi in there, like the Ansible for instantaneous communication and so forth, today there's so much remote.
Enabled, Dan.
You think so?
I do.
There's
on our plausibility standard, absolutely. Not for patent law standard, but it's reduced to plausibility to me.
Well, anyway, in these days of, remote warfare, remote control, drones, I think if you're on, any sort of intelligence or national security committee, I would love for everybody to read that before they start making any grand strategic plans.
All right, that's awesome. I think everyone got in. So the next question from the group, and forgive me if I'm butchering anyone's name, but I believe it's pronounced Valina Betty. How can sci-fi be used to re-envision racial justice in America?
Great question to ask a bunch of white people.
Speak for yourself, John.
Yeah. I would say the first way that it can be used to re-envision racial justice is by making sure that you are reading the authors who are currently thinking about racial justice within the realm of science fiction and fantasy. The good news is, especially within the last decade, that number has exploded. Even still, when I came into science fiction in 2005, it could fairly be said that science fiction and fantasy looked mostly like me. Today, it's not necessarily the case. Nora Jemisin has come and has moved to the forefront of science fiction and fantasy in a way that will make her one of the greats of the genre, unquestionably 10, 15 years down the line. There's a whole, resurgence of Black science fiction and fantasy that we haven't had before. And honestly, I can't name names because my brain, they're falling out of my head even as I'm trying to remember them. But read the folks who come in from a different experience, and that will tell you more than certainly I can, and I suspect anybody on this panel can.
Camilla, so I saw two things. I had Camilla in chat and then Victoria. Sorry, Camilla, is it okay if Victoria goes and then you?
Oh, yep.
That's
ahead,
okay.
Victoria.
I'll be quick. One of the I am a member of the Lumbee Indian Nation in North Carolina, by the way. That wasn't on my resume, but one of the reasons I mentioned the Ursula Le Guin book is because it focuses on Indigenous people, and it's also a cautionary tale about maybe you should be listening to Indigenous people instead of imposing dominant legal systems on them. And that is, I think it's a very, it was written, I guess, in the 1970s, I'm thinking. So it doesn't bring current political conflicts into the story, which might make it easier for people to read without resistance. So that's one of the books I think that is really good to read as terms of science fiction, Indigenous people. And I will say that I do documentary and filmmaking too. And I've been at a number of film festivals, Native American film festivals, and there is a big movement of creating science fiction and Native American characters as superheroes. So, and also science fiction stories and writing. And I've talked to several colleagues about some really interesting takes on that. So you can search and find some of it, and it is very, very interesting. It's a very different perspective on science fiction. So it is out there, and I think it is a growing area. I hope some of it will enter the mainstream so more people can get exposed to it.
Camilla, you're up.
Oh, so I'd like to throw a wrench, which is, I think the reason we can't remember any names except for, say, Jemisin, is because there aren't many. And there is a serious problem in the science fiction genre, just as there is in my field of patent law, of exclusion. And so, if you read work by, scholar Lisa Yasek on the history of, and I'm thinking here mostly about gender exclusion because we weren't even discussing race exclusion back then, but, the editors of Astounding, like John Campbell, they would literally decline to publish the works of women or people who didn't look like a sci-fi writer was supposed to look. And I'm talking about not just race, I'm talking about gender, but I'm also talking about education level. It's like only if you are a physicist. I mean, Isaac Asimov was a professor of chemistry or whatever. And it's an extremely exclusionary field. And John, I don't mean to pick on this, but I noted when you talked about sort of the archetypical sci-fi reader, who is it? It's a 12-year-old boy. And it's very frustrating. And I, as somebody who was a huge X-Men fan, I actually interviewed at Marvel Comics, by the way. That was my dream job, I suppose, before going to grad school. And I didn't get the job, but I was later called by, I won't name the name, but an editor there who wanted to interview me about what it was like to be a girl who read comics and what they could do to attract more girls to their comics. So it's a huge problem in sci-fi, and it's very irritating, because I would go to the comic stores and I'd be one of very few girls in there, and I'd get asked out. And so it's a hugely and then that's whatever. But I think Jemison is a name you can think of because she's one that's gotten a lot of press and attention. But it's a very exclusionary field.
John,
I'm
did you have anything you wanted to say on that?
Yeah,
I think you agree.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that at all. I mean, I think it has been incredibly exclusionary. You mentioned Campbell specifically, and the problem with Campbell, and this was something that was actually brought up by Jeanette Ning, who won the what was the Campbell Award is now the Astounding Award, was not only was he an editor who had his particular thing of you need to be this, you need to be a white dude who is in the hard sciences, but he was the top editor, so everything was written to him, and then everything that he didn't take was then passed down to Galaxy and then to whatever else there was. So that one person created the genre that we knew up until very, very recently, and that was a real problem. Camilla, you are absolutely correct that it has been an exclusionary field. It has been getting better, but we're still fighting that fight, and it's really difficult for people to understand that science fiction is as science fiction is because it was the way it was, but it didn't have to be that way.
It didn't have to be that way. Campbell was so influential. We have a whole section in our paper, if I can give the plug, on the history of Campbell's involvement in who got published. And frankly, the Focita, the fan of ordinary skill of art, the term we coined, it was a man. It was a man. Mm-hmm. It was a guy. The Focita is not a guy today, and is not a white guy. We need to move beyond that.
Yeah. That's great.
Could I just throw in?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Victoria.
J.K. Rowling's editor told her to use her initials instead of her first name because 10-year-old boys would not read her book.
No. Yeah, that's all absolutely known. And I'm glad you brought that up, Victoria, because it matters a ton across. I mean, this is where, as a weird side note, hopefully there's more blind in some ways intake, because that too can break it open. But on the flip side, maybe more openly, and I believe it's happening in Atlanta and other places, there are publishing houses and producing houses that are actually saying, hey, we actually want to see kind of what Camilla, you were asked to do, but actually be the producers and creators. So as a tangent, I don't disagree with anything, but I would suggest that one of the things we've been talking about does fit a little, which is sometimes, and this is coming from a friend of mine who once said, when people said, I just can't imagine what it's like for you, and he's African-American, he said, sure you can. You know me. Now imagine. I do think that in some cases, what we get out of sci-fi it reminds me of what Rod Serling pointed out, is unfortunate, but it gives you a way to have people engage with things which they would otherwise shut out, to kind of riff on what Victoria was saying, right? He wanted to talk about race. He wanted to talk about all sorts of justice issues, but he had to get around censors, and sci-fi was his avenue to that. Now, does that justify not having the representation we've been talking about? No. But I do think sometimes sci-fi authors are purposely using it to be transgressive, and they can do it in ways that are overt or through the story, right? Like the whole question of when people say, well, let's talk about whether you own robots and things like that. The overtones that you can explore with that are huge.
Yes.
John, it looks like you wanted to jump in.
I was about to say yes, but, and I'm going to quote Nora Inge Jemison here, where she was making the point that, yes, science fiction has always lauded itself as being the place where you can play with ideas and slip them underneath the door so that people will feel comfortable walking that mile in shoes, in an alien's shoes instead of a black person's shoes. She has made the argument, and I think that it's actually an important one, and I'm going to mischaracterize it because I'm remembering it poorly. But she says, that's all very nice, but we can't really afford that. You actually do have to have Black people writing about Black experiences that white people can and do read, and not just Black people having their own experiences, but Native Americans and people who are trans and people who are of other minorities and other experiences. That the power of illusion and the power of metaphor is all well and good, but we are at the point where it also matters that science fiction and fantasy isn't just illusion and metaphor.
Right. I don't disagree. What I was pointing out was I think the overlap matters, right? Like, there are times when you'll still be able to reach people because you're this goes back to even, you think about the French monarchies. The literature at that point was absolutely hidden as a huge, hey, you guys need to get in on the fact that there's incredibly bad things. Now, can those voices be broader? Can they be more in your face today? I hope so. There may be more, but we also have two questions. And one of these, I think, connects to what we've been saying. So let's just try that, please. From Jonathan Franklin. Can any of the speakers suggest science fiction works that address how societies with split realities can be brought together? If Star Trek's Federation is the ideal, what works to address how we get from here to there? Now, I asked for a clarification. And the clarification that I got about split realities was, in a world with misinformation and realities created by tweets without virtual reality, but could be any two realities, how do we bring them together? Or is there a point where people cannot be brought together if their realities are too different? And to me, this connects a little bit to what we were trying to discuss so far, which is, okay, you need to get more voices out there. But at the same time, I think, as I understand this question, and forgive me, Jonathan, if I'm wrong, there's a question of bridging, right? Literature sometimes speaks directly to one person as a riff to set this up. I remember when I finally read Rushdie, it opened my eyes about different parts of literature as compared to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because for the first time I could hear my uncles on the page. Mm-hmm. Right? Marquez spoke to me in ways I think it resonated just because he writes about humanity, but there's an extra layer. So, that sense of reality then that Jonathan's getting at is how do we actually get from there to here? So, and in 2 minutes, sorry. Anyone?
Start with young adult fiction. You get people reading when they're young. You give them a wide number of experiences to immerse themselves into, and give them a wide number of a wide variety of authors with those wide variety of life experiences to delve into. The earlier you get people to understand that the world is not just their world, the easier it will be for them to make those bridges.
Cool. Other folks? Camilla?
Oh, well, I mean, in terms of split realities, things that come to mind. Well, speaking of young adult fiction, right? Divergent. Maybe we're just all going to be divided into factions and live in our factions separately. But I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff on TV right now, like The Expanse. People seeing The Expanse about, the complex political situations between just truly divergent cultures. Also, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, I think, gets a lot of those issues. Fantastic book. But if I had more time, I'd have a better response. Yeah.
Dan, go for it.
Yeah, another one I would recommend, and maybe this takes the question even a step further, but there was a book called Golden State by Ben Winters that the premise has to do with a place where lies are the highest form of criminality. Of course, it's a response to our times right now. And there's a speculative service, a sort of enforcement agency in criminal investigations, and only they are allowed to make inferences from observation. Everybody else is held to strict truths. So I think it's a really fun premise, and I think he handles the idea really, really interestingly.
Awesome. We are actually out of time, but at that point, I just want to again thank everyone. I hope those out in We can't see you, Lan, unfortunately, but in the chat seemed to have been very active and enjoyed it. And with that, we'll say have a great rest of the conference and thank you for being here. Stay in touch. Keep reading.